and thank you for joining us for this live broadcast this evening. I'm Gloria Quidu, and this is the Caritas Consciousness Project. As our name implies, our purpose is to promote the evolution of consciousness individually and collectively. We do this through lectures, workshops, classes, and study groups, many of which we are now live broadcasting and recording. We also offer free healing sessions by appointment in the Spiritist healing tradition. The programs we select, whether addressing healing, paranormal faculties, spiritual exploration, or science, are all in the service of increasing our understanding of our true nature and our role in the unfoldment of our collective destiny. In our live broadcast this evening, we're delighted to have Dr. Dean Radin, who will be speaking to us about the resurrection of real magic in the 21st century, also the title of his latest book. Dr. Radin is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and Distinguished Professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He earned an MS in Electrical Engineering and a Ph.D. in Psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Before joining the research staff at IONS in 2001, Dr. Radin held appointments at AT&T Bell Labs, Princeton University, University of Edinburgh, and SRI International. He's given over 500 talks and interviews worldwide, and he's the author or co-author of hundreds of scientific and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, 2 technical books, and 4 popular books translated into 15 foreign languages. The Conscious Universe, 1997, Entangled Minds, 2006, Supernormal, 2013, and Real Magic in 2018. And now let me present Dr. Dean Radin.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Gloria. So here's our title, Resurrection of Real Magic in the 21st Century. So we're trying to create a bridge here between science and magic. And we'll go into a little more detail on what I mean by magic in a little bit. First of all, what do I mean by science? Science is, first of all, a set of methods for observing and analyzing nature. It's also explanations or theories of those observations. So it provides a theoretical worldview, a way of understanding the observations that we see, and then an assumption that that worldview is actually describing reality itself. That's what science is. So what is the bridge then that science can study when it's considering phenomena like magic, spirits, all of that? And the answer is that what science can study are human experiences of a particular type. It's human experiences that transcend time and space. That's what makes them interesting. So there are 3 kinds of experiences then. There are mystical experiences, psychic experiences, and magical experiences. That's what science can study. So before I get into the details here, I just want to say a little bit more about my background, because you would not expect, based on my background, that I would have been studying psychic phenomena and magic for almost 40 years now, actually over 40 years. So when I started out as a violinist, starting at age 5, and was a professional by about the age of 20, and continued to play until about age 25. So for 20 years, my primary advocation and vocation was being a violinist. Then I decided in college that there were other ways of making a living. Almost all of my friends who are musicians said that if you can do anything other than making a living as a musician, that's what you should do. So I did. I went on to get degrees in electrical engineering and then in psychology, and worked first at AT&T Bell Labs, later also at GTE Labs, doing similar research on telecommunications. I also worked at SRI International, which is a big science for hire outfit. in Menlo Park, California, and then at Princeton University for a number of years and the University of Edinburgh for a number of years. So in all of that, you probably wouldn't guess that I was actually studying psychic phenomena, either full-time or part-time. I've also given lots and lots of talks in universities, in Harvard, Stanford, Columbia, Cambridge, and many others. I've given talks to industry, including Google, Johnson & Johnson, and Merck, to foreign governments, including Australia and Malaysia. Many TV shows. After about 100 TV shows, I lost count, but almost every network in the United States and in Europe, and a couple that are foreign language as well. For the Naval Postgraduate School, the Naval War College, DARPA, and the U.S. Army Special Operations. So all of this is to say that looking at that as a background would not lead you to believe that in almost every case, the places where I've worked, the places I've given talks to, they were interested in psychic phenomena. And that's why I was invited to give those talks. So for the past 18 years, I've been a scientist and now chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And for the past couple of years, a distinguished professor of transpersonal and integral psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies, which is a graduate school in San Francisco. So because I've given lots of talks and interviews, this is now about a year ago, I gave an interview for CBS News Sunday Morning, and the interviewer asked a question, what is ESP? Of course, she means, what is extrasensory perception? So I said, well, it's a form of perception that is extended through space or time. We normally think of perception as being here and now, but this kind of perception is there and then, elsewhere in both space and time. So she said, is there any scientific evidence that ESP exists? And so I said, yeah, there's lots of evidence. For example, here's the president of the American Statistical Association, Jessica Utz. And in 2016, she gave a presidential address. And as part of that, she said, to the surprise of the people in the audience, the data in support of precognition and possibly other related psychic phenomena are quite strong statistically and would be widely accepted if they pertain to something more mundane. Likewise, about a year ago, there was an article in a journal called American Psychologist, which is the flagship journal of the American Psychological Association. So it's top tier both in clinical psychology and in experimental psychology in the academic world. So what this conclusion was that the evidence for psi, meaning psychic phenomena, is comparable to that for established phenomena in psychology and other disciplines. So the interviewer said, but some scientists insist that ESP is impossible. So what do you think of that? She said, as an example, here's Sean Carroll, a physicist at Caltech, who says, basically believes that everything is made out of matter, not surprising for a physicist, including the brain. Well, the mind is identical to the brain. The brain can't transcend space-time. Therefore, ESP is impossible. So this is a fairly common set of beliefs from scientists. Here, for example, is Steven Weinberg, a Nobel laureate physicist who got the Nobel Prize for his theory of the electroweak theory, which combined the electromagnetic force with the weak force. He said, if there were anything to psychic phenomena, that would really be the discovery of the century. In fact, it would be more than that. It would overturn all the centuries of work since the birth of modern science. He goes on to say, we already understand why things are the way they are, which I thought is kind of an arrogant statement, but that's what he believed. And what he's saying is, in other words, according to science today, as we understand reality today, psychic phenomena are literally impossible. And that has very important consequences, because if you think something's impossible, then you don't have to pay any attention to evidence, because you'll assume the evidence is impossible. And we see that more recently in another article in American Psychologist, written by two long-term skeptics searching for the impossible, parapsychology's elusive quest. And what they say in their article is, our position is straightforward. Claims made by parapsychologists cannot be true. The effects reported could have no ontological status, and the data have no existential value. This is actually an anti-scientific position, because it's saying that we don't care that there's actually experimental evidence. It has no value. It's ontologically impossible. Therefore, we won't pay any attention to it. And as they say in the classic English ad natum, which means hyperbole, pigs cannot fly. So again, from a scientific perspective, this is not a scientific argument anymore. This is an argument like a polemic in a religious sense. It's arguing based purely on theory and says, we're not going to pay any attention to the evidence. It doesn't matter what you say, pigs cannot fly. So that's the kind of pretty strong skepticism that is not really even skepticism. It's more like a position that a denier would take. We're not going to pay attention to what you're saying because we believe we're right. There's no debate there. So this is my response to that. I mean, what are you going to do? So I respond to the question, well, I'm saying they're talking about theoretical assumptions, but the experimental evidence is very clear. And she asks then, well, why don't we know about this? And the answer is, besides Mr. Grumpy Cat getting a little annoyed at this point, the answer is that we're dealing with a scientific worldview. Most scientists are trained, spend their entire career thinking about the world in this particular way, and it makes it very, very difficult to imagine that the world might not be completely that way. So what is it? It's the worldview is materialism, and it assumes that at the base of everything is physics, meaning matter and energy. That's what everything is made out of. And from that emerges a slightly more complicated set of objects and phenomena that we call chemistry, and from that is biology, and from that is psychology. And somehow then magically out of all of this arises consciousness, meaning awareness. In spite of the fact that nobody has any idea at all how the physical world can give rise to something like consciousness, which is not physical. It's something that is subjective, but doesn't have a clear objective reality, so it's non-physical. Nobody knows how that can be, but that's the assumption. One of the consequences of this position is both philosophers and some psychologists who say that basically we're zombies. We have the appearance of living creatures that have awareness, but that's just an illusion. It's like a zombie. It's a dead thing, but it looks like it's alive. And so from this position, any evidence, even personal experience having to do with psychic phenomena, is denied as impossible. So this is what you're up against when, as a scientist, you're studying human experiences. Some people believe they're simply impossible. So here, for example, is Daniel Dennett, the philosopher from Tufts University, who says we're all zombies. Nobody is conscious, as he explains in his book entitled Consciousness Explained, which is rather odd. The thing is that the scientific worldview today on materialism, it is not reasonable to throw it away. It's just way too effective. Virtually everything that we know from a scientific perspective today is based on this idea that materialism is being an effective phenomenon. So psychic phenomena exist empirically, and something is missing.
Dean, we're not hearing you. Did you press your mute button?
I don't think so.
Oh, there, you're back now. You're back now.
Oh, okay. Was I away for a while or just a few
No,
minutes?
just for maybe 5 seconds.
Okay, I did get a message saying internet was unstable, which is odd, but okay. So thanks for letting me know. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about mind-matter interaction. Can we mentally affect probabilistic systems like the toss of dice? And that was done for about 50 years worth. And then another 50 years based on electronic versions of dice called random number generators. That's a version that was built in the early 80s. And today you can buy a very similar circuit and it's just like a little memory stick, which is a quite good random number generator. So here's part of an experiment that was reported from Princeton University. There was a group there for almost 30 years doing these kinds of experiments. And you look at the output of the random generator and you mentally will the generator to produce more ones than zeros, because all it does is produce ones and zeros randomly. So after many trials and many people, you found that sure enough, you start to produce more ones when people were trying to mentally make it do that, and more zeros when you're trying to do that. And if there was a control condition, the baseline, you meander around chance. So this is one of many such experiments. When I was at Princeton with a colleague, we did a meta-analysis looking at all of the studies we could find. More than 800 had been reported in the literature at that time. And what we found is pretty clear: unequivocal positive effects in the experimental conditions and chance results in control conditions. So at that time, this is not 1989, it was already very clear that something about consciousness, in particular will, is able to push the world around a little bit. What we've been doing now is bringing these up to date. We're using electrical plasma in the laboratory now. The task is pretty straightforward. You get one of these little plasma balls, cost about $40 or $50, and you have somebody mentally try to will the streamers from the plasma to go in one direction or the other. So we put the plasma ball inside an electromagnetically shielded room. We have a webcam looking at it, and that image is then taken outside at a distance, and people try to mentally influence the ball. I'm going to go backwards for a second. So with the plasma ball, normally the streamers would go in just in every direction all at once. The question is, if you tried to mentally push them to the right, would that happen? So first of all, we see here what's happening under control conditions. The yellow boxes are showing places where when you're trying to influence it and you're not trying to influence it, that's a differential measure. And it's looking for portions where the streamers were a little bit brighter than otherwise. And it shows under control conditions where nobody was trying to do anything, there are occasionally spots that show up that are a little bit brighter in one condition than the next, even though no one was trying to do anything. But when you have people involved in the experiment and they are mentally trying to move the streamers around, you get many more areas that are significantly different in terms of the light. And more importantly, if they're trying to push the light to the right, you see much more light actually showing up on the right side. So this is a pretty simple, but so far quite effective experiment. You can't see this happening in real time. In other words, you don't see the streamers actually moving. You need a lot of data and a lot of statistics to see this, but the results are pretty clear statistically. So what about effects in the everyday world? Most of the kinds of studies I do are relatively small effects in physics-oriented systems. What about the everyday world? So, for example, can our intentions influence food? One of the reasons I thought of doing this is because I know chefs who insist that if the people in the kitchen are happy and trying to produce food with the sense of happiness, that people respond to it better than if everybody in the kitchen is yelling at each other with anger. So perhaps it means that something about attention or intention is influencing the food itself. So we used chocolate in our experiment. And it was a double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled experiment, which is the gold standard when you're trying to test if something makes a difference. So we asked a Buddhist monk, we also asked a Mongolian shaman that we knew to imbue some samples of chocolate with an enhanced sense of energy, vigor, and well-being. This meant that anybody who had that chocolate would get this change in their mood, but we had identical chocolate that was not blessed. And so these are the chocolate pieces that we then handed out. One group got the blessed chocolate, they're very happy. And there was also a control group, got the same chocolate, but that wasn't blessed. And under double-blind conditions, so they didn't know what kind of chocolate they were getting. And the people who were giving them the chocolate didn't know either. That's where the double-blind comes in. So on each day over the course of the week, they filled out a standardized mood scale. And on days Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, they ate the chocolate. And the days before, the days after, they did not. But we had mood scales in every day. And so this is the final result. We found that the mood was significantly better in people getting the blessed chocolate than the people getting controlled chocolate. So this is showing the means and the error bars of that experiment. So that basically said that for people eating chocolate that was blessed in this way, their mood actually got better. Significantly improved mood. So this was published in 2007. Another experiment, can we influence tea? So this is using the same kind of idea, except this started with a big pot of oolong tea. The tea was put into two separate pots, one of which was blessed by 3 Buddhist monks in Taiwan. The other one was not blessed. And then the tea was put into little packages, and 100 people in each group, and they got these little bottles of either the blessed tea or the not blessed tea. And the bottom line there, again, under double-blind conditions, placebo-controlled, people getting the blessed tea reported better mood than people who got the untreated tea, the not blessed tea. So again, we found significantly improved tea as a result of a mental blessing. So this one we published in 2013. So the next one was, we wanted something that was not a subjective measure, but an objective measure. So we said, well, can we do the same experiment with blessed water to see if it would influence the growth of plants? So we use this plant, Arabidopsis thaliana. It's a little mustard seed plant. You can find it growing basically everywhere, but it's from the mustard family. And the reason why it's interesting is because the genome of this plant has been fully sequenced. In fact, it was fully sequenced before the human genome. So there's quite a bit known about this plant from a genetic perspective. So we had the same 3 Buddhist monks bless water to then hydrate the seeds and see whether they would grow differently than the control water. And there's my partner in Taiwan. So the water and the seeds were given to somebody who was blind as to what kind of water they were given. And all that this person did, a technician, is that they would grow seeds. And they would oftentimes grow under different conditions. So the seeds were grown in the usual way, and then they did a variety of measures on the seeds at the end. This measurement of most interest is called the hypocotyl, which is the distance from the roots to the bottom of the leaves. It's a healthy plant has a short, fat hypocotyl. It means that the plant is quite healthy. It's not expending very much energy in order to open the leaves. And if the seed was upside down, for example, it has to turn itself upside down in the dirt. It spends a lot of energy to do that, and the hypocotyl would be long and skinny. So one of our measures was this hypocotyl. So this is the results of doing 12 repeated experiments. And you see at a glance there that the hypocotyl was very significantly smaller. It was a short, fat hypocotyl, like a healthy plant, as compared to the control. Now, in terms of actual magnitude, you can see it's only like 1/10 of a millimeter difference. But we had lots and lots of seeds, lots of repetition. So these error bars are telling us with very high confidence that even though it's a pretty small effect, one millimeter, we have very high confidence that that effect is real. So the blessed water resulted in better growing seeds. So significantly improved seed growth. We published this in 2017. If I could go through this exercise and talk about use of photons and random events and water, food, wine, plants, human cells, bacterial cells, animal health, animal behavior, human health, human behavior, lots and lots of studies looking at the effect of intention on these kinds of systems. And in virtually all of these cases, we find that there are real effects. They tend to be quite small, so usually you can't see it with your eye. You have to run repeated trials and use statistics to see it, but it's a real effect. So we do see effects of intention on the physical world. So now we come to a more difficult question. If these phenomena exist, which the data suggests is the way it is, then how does it work? How do we begin to understand these kinds of effects? Well, so here's one clue. And the clue is this, that the deeper and more closely we examine the nature of the physical world, this is largely on the basis of physics, but not only physics, what we find is that the world begins to dissolve into abstractions. And when we go down as far as we can get, all that seems to be left are possibilities. Now, this is based on quantum mechanics, which is ultimately a theory about possibilities. And yet it also describes the way the physical world works really, really well. So you imagine then that you have a microscope that is stronger and stronger and stronger until you can look down way below atoms. What you see at that level is no longer matter. It's not even energy, really. It's something like possibilities, information, very abstract ideas. So this is one clue then that, well, how do these psychic phenomena work? Well, it has something to do with information. The other clue, and this is how we connect it to magic, is about magic. So what do I mean? Well, first of all, when I say the word magic, what most people think about are these movies, these stories. And they're compelling and people like them, and it's a multi-billion-dollar business because people like stories about magic. So you need to understand that, first of all, when we see these kinds of stories, that of course, these are embellishments, like any story is. They're going to make it much, much stronger than the way it really manifests. So yes, it's about these stories, but it's much, much more realistic and as a result, much weaker in terms of the magnitude than these kinds of stories. Also, we're not talking about fictional magic. We're not talking about Harry Potter, although there's some elements of it that are Harry Potter-ish. We're not going to talk about other forms of fictional magic, like movies like Practical Magic or Magic Mike. Not that either. It's not fake magic. These are illusions that simulate magic. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about real magic. Well, what is real magic? First of all, by analogy, magic is to the esoteric worldview as technology is to the scientific worldview. In other words, once you have a certain understanding of the way the world works, or worldview, you can apply it. So our technology today is an application of the scientific worldview. And by the same token, if your worldview is the esoteric worldview, magic would be an application of that. It's a practice. So there are three practices. There's divination, which, if you think about it from a psychic perspective, we're talking about clairvoyance and precognition. That's what divination is as a practice. The second is force of will, which is similar to what I was talking about in terms of, can your intention influence the world? The answer from a magical perspective is called force of will. And the third is theurgy, in which involves interacting with, communicating with spirits. So those are the three practices of magic, which are based on esoteric ideas. So that's the topic of my latest book, Real Magic. I was fortunate to get endorsements of the book by two Nobel laureate scientists, Brian Josephson in physics, Kary Mullis in chemistry, and many, many other scientists and academics who I know. And I could have gone to people who are more on the interested in magic, perhaps, or meditation to endorse the book. But the book is really about science. So I wanted to see if my scientific friends would endorse it, and they did. I've got many endorsements. So what do we mean by the esoteric traditions? Well, you can begin to study it by going all the way back to shamanism, as far back as history goes, and you begin to see a certain story that develops, which describes what the esoteric traditions are all about. So esoteric traditions, including Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, Kabbalah, alchemy, Gnosticism, mostly from the Western traditions, and from the East, yoga, the Vedas, Kashmir Shaivism, Buddhism, and many, many others. These are all part of a single thread, actually, even though there are cultural differences and language differences. The underlying ideas in these esoteric traditions are more or less the same. In more modern times, this is still only medieval times, we find things like the Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the Theosophy, Gurdjieff, the Knights Templar. When you look at trying to synthesize what is common among these esoteric traditions, you find books like The Perennial Philosophy by Aldous Huxley. There are a number of other books like this. But what it comes down to is this idea that consciousness is fundamental. That's the essence of the esoteric traditions, both Eastern and Western. Well, consciousness is fundamental. We go back to our hierarchy of disciplines. A philosopher would say this is idealism. Idealism takes the same structure as we saw before, except that it does this. It puts consciousness below physics. That means that consciousness is now primary. It's fundamental, more fundamental than physics. So from this perspective, psychic phenomena, mystical phenomena, magic are not only accepted, they're actually easy to understand. Because if consciousness is more fundamental than the physical world, and consciousness, it transcends space-time, because it's before space and time, which are physical concepts, then the idea that the mind can have access to things which seem to be limited by physics, which is why physicists say it's impossible, well, it's no longer impossible, because physics actually comes first. One of the underlying questions and difficulties then with this idea is, well, how do you get from consciousness into physics? How do you get from something which is non-physical into something that is physical? Well, it turns out that this is a question that a lot of people have been looking at. How do you get from ancient esoteric lore into science today and then the future of science? How do you do that? Well, this is the topic of my book, which I am shamelessly mentioning again. And so I'm going to borrow a couple of slides from John Hagelin, who is the head of the Transcendental Meditation Organization. He is talking in terms of what we can think of as kind of an iceberg. So the iceberg is a convenient metaphor because it talks about things which are above the surface and things which are below the surface. So the way John puts it is that we think about matter and energy that are obvious to us. These are like above the surface. And it includes all of our technologies, things like electronics and telecommunications and so on. And we look at the underlying theories, we're talking about classical mechanics, thermodynamics, acoustics, optics, and so on. These are all kind of common sense. But as soon as you go below the surface, we're not talking about nuclear physics, quantum mechanics, atomic physics. And if you go below that, we're talking about electromagnetism, the weak force, strong force, various kinds of force fields. And the force fields are electromagnetic, weak, strong, and gravity. And then on the other side, you're talking about things that are called matter fields, like neutrinos, leptons, and quarks. But we even go below that into what many physicists believe is a unified field. Is it below quantum field theory? This is an assumption that all of the laws of nature somehow arise out of some unified sense. So what's interesting is that there's a parallel to here when it comes to the human mind. So at the top level, the surface level, is our conscious everyday mind. We're all familiar with that. But we know from both neuroscience, psychotherapy, and a lot of other data that there are unconscious aspects of the mind too. There's preconscious, subconscious, unconscious, and so on, going all the way down. And an assumption, especially in the meditative traditions, that at the bottom there's something like a pure consciousness unified field. So here we see a parallel between mind and matter, where there's conscious level and then a lot that's going on below the conscious level. At the top, we talk about common sense, literally meaning the common senses, the 6 or 7 senses that we have. When you go down a little bit, we're talking about psychic senses. Some people have them consciously, many do not. Below that, mystical senses, a sense of unification of reality. Again, some people have that, many people don't. There's a third parallel here, which is important because it's mathematics. So when you start at the top of this, we're talking about counting numbers, like we have 5 fingers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, counting numbers. And then we start getting more abstract, fractional numbers, irrational numbers, transcendental numbers, imaginary numbers, transfinite numbers. These are all well understood mathematics, but they're become more and more abstract as you go down, so to speak, in mathematics. You can then also look at the operations that we use in mathematics. So with integers, you can do algebra, but then we end up with linear algebra, calculus, tensors, Lie algebra, gauge theory, set theory, in each case becoming more and more abstract. And the important part here is that in order to describe the physical world, especially within physics, you can't do it with just integers. You can't do it with fractions. You can't even do it with irrational numbers. You need extremely abstract numbers like imaginary numbers and transfinite numbers using very complicated operations like gauge theory and set theory. So to describe the reality in a physical way, you need mathematics, which is also very much like the mind, has surface level obvious numbers, but then very, very deep abstract ways of thinking about mathematics too. Well, what is mathematics? Mathematics is a purely symbolic language that was dreamt up in some way by 3 pounds of neural tissue in your head. That's what mathematics is. And mathematics goes all the way up to the top of physics, all the way to the bottom. It is necessary in order for us to describe the physical world. What's very interesting then is this is also an important part of the esoteric traditions. The esoteric traditions essentially say that reality is symbolic in nature. It's a kind of a language. And you can see this very clearly, for example, in the Kabbalah, the book of creation, which talks about a language of 22 letters and 10 numbers, which, when put together in the right way, actually create the physical world as we know it. So the esoteric traditions then are kind of ahead of where science is today because it's already talking about symbolic language as a way of getting from consciousness into the physical world. You see, there are many models like that in the esoteric traditions. In the modern world, we are more like this. We're Alice in Wonderland. We're looking deep into the nature of physical reality, and we pull back the curtain, and what do we see? We see the matrix. We see information. We see things that look digital even. So very unlike the physical world. In addition, if you look at thought leaders now, in information theory and quantum mechanics and mathematics and in neuroscience, you see again and again that thought leaders are saying, these are all mainstream people, that the nature of reality is information. The nature of reality is quantum information. The nature of reality is mathematics. The nature of reality is a form of consciousness. For example, Christoph Koch says, and he's a mainstream prominent neuroscientist, I believe that consciousness is a fundamental and elementary property of living matter. It can't be derived from anything else. This is very interesting because this is very, very close now to what the esoteric traditions are saying, which says that as science continues on trying to understand the nature of reality, it's beginning to bump into consciousness as fundamental, and more scientists are saying this. You also see this reflected in academic presses. So there's Columbia Academic Press, Oxford University Press, the American Psychological Association Press, and the American Institutes of Physics, all of which in recent times have published books talking about these ideas, that we have to rethink the nature of consciousness, rethink the nature of spirituality. This is new. 20 years ago, you'd never find an academic press publishing these kinds of books. You see articles in very orthodox popular science magazines like Scientific American saying things like the world's smartest physicist thinks science can't crack consciousness. And so we're talking here about Edward Witten, who's one of the main string theory physicists, says consciousness will remain a mystery. Likewise, in BBC Earth, the BBC is not known for being particularly progressive, but they had a big article on the strange link between the human mind and quantum physics. And in it, they're talking about the double slit experiment. And they say that the sheer act of noticing, rather than any physical disturbance caused by measuring, can cause the collapse, talking about a change in the way that light behaves. It is hard to avoid the implication that consciousness and quantum mechanics are somehow linked. Well, that means that mind and matter are linked from a quantum mechanical perspective. Likewise, here's the MIT Technology Review talking about a recent, very recent, quantum experiment suggesting there's no such thing as objective reality because two observers can look at the same thing and experience different realities. And there's an experiment now that demonstrates that. Likewise, again, Scientific American. The question is no longer whether quantum theory is correct, but what it means. These experiments suggest a primary role for mind in nature. Even Nature, the journal Nature, which is one of the top 2 scientific journals in the world, have articles now on the mental universe. So what I've been talking about so far for about 45 minutes or so is primarily analytical data. We're talking about experiments, about ways of scientifically looking at these phenomena. But there are other ways of directly experiencing these effects. So I'm going to switch from analytical to more intuitive way of just talking about these things. So I'll do it like this. When I heard the learned scientist, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the scientist where she lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars. So I'm going to end there. Thank you for your attention. And the question and answer box is open. I see no questions. So feel free to ask some questions, and we have plenty of time for a discussion, or at least I can answer the questions. So I think maybe I'll stop sharing at that point, and then you can see my picture better. Okay, questions? What is the relationship between mystery and magic? I'm using the word magic as a placeholder for something that we don't have a name for. Magic is mysterious in the sense that we don't understand it, but at the leading edge of science, practically everything is mysterious. There are lots of things that we don't understand from in a scientific perspective. So the relationship between mystery and magic is that we use the term magic to represent a mystery, and in this case, the mystery is psychic phenomena. We really don't have a good explanation for it yet. The closest that I can come to it is looking at the esoteric traditions, and I have colleagues around the world who are developing other theories. So mine is based on a different philosophical set of assumptions. I assume that if the esoteric traditions have persisted for 10,000 years, that people 10,000 years ago were just as smart as we are today. They had a different way of thinking about reality. They didn't have the tools that we have today, but they were pretty smart, and they were able to think about things in ways that we find it difficult to. We're constantly distracted today by our technology and everything else. People long ago had, some of them had the luxury of time with very few distractions to think in different ways, especially in the meditative traditions. So if you have people who spend their lives meditating and they're coming up with what amounts to the esoteric lore, I think it'd be just foolish for us today to ignore all of that as though it was superstition. I think some of it is probably real. My colleagues in developing theories, some of them are saying, well, no, we can actually use quantum mechanics to understand why psychic phenomena and magic, as a result, why those things are real. Others use more classical methods like thermodynamics. but we're still working on it. We don't have a theory that everybody's going to agree with at this point as to why these, these phenomena, which we know are real empirically, how do we explain it? We don't know yet. So there's plenty of mysteries. And by the way, plenty of mysteries in virtually every other area of science. You look at journals in scientific disciplines, almost all of what's being reported is at the edge of the unknown. Because who wants to do something that's already understood? Doesn't make any sense. So science is all about
discovery. All about discovery and exploration of things that we don't know. Okay.
How can all of this make for a better world? That's a very good question. And actually, in another talk, I spend quite a bit of time on that. One of the things about materialism as a doctrine or as a worldview is that it leads to an understanding that is nihilistic. That means that if you are taught that there's no meaning or purpose to reality, it's all a matter of random chance, then there's no point to anything, right? There's no inherent meaning, there's no purpose. In that worldview, human beings are machines made out of meat. And that is, in a sense, that is the currency today. That's a mainstream idea, primarily in the neurosciences. The assumption is that you are your brain, literally. So when the brain dies, that's the end of the story. It's also why psychic phenomena can't exist, because the brain doesn't transcend space-time. It's locked inside your head somewhere. So if you completely believe that we live in a world where you are your brain, in a meaningless, pointless universe, and we're machines made out of meat, it makes a lot of sense that what you can do as an individual to be the best that you can be is not worry about other people. It's not worry about resources around the world. It's to die with the most toys. That's one of the ways of putting it. He who dies with the most toys has won the game, because the game from this perspective is you're just a hunk of meat, comes out of a meaningless universe, you're going to die, the game's over. Well, that's actually almost a rational response if the scientific worldview today, if materialism is correct, because then there is no ultimate meaning for anything. But if that worldview is either completely wrong or slightly wrong, well, we know it has a lot going for it. It's a pretty good worldview. It allows me to do this webinar, for example. It's probably not completely wrong, but it's also not completely right. And so where are we missing? What have we overlooked somehow? Where's the assumptions about today's worldview that are not correct? Well, one of the things that psychic phenomena, mystical experience, these kinds of phenomena are telling us that you probably are not just your brain. Some of you is your brain, but there's more than that. There's something else going on that makes us more than machines made out of meat. And as soon as that question starts to be taken seriously, it means that maybe we don't live in a nihilistic universe. We live in a universe that has meaning somehow built into it somewhere. That dramatically changes then the nature of who and what we think we are. And that's why it's so important to do research on these kinds of experiences, because it is challenging the notion which drives the way that most of the world works. You can imagine if you were to step back and look at the mess that the world is in today, and we seem to be heading off the edge of a cliff, a lot of it is based on this notion that we're machines made out of meat. And so we use all the resources now, and it'll end at some point. If you happen to be a religious person, you believe in fantasy of some kind of heaven afterwards. And if you don't, you wouldn't care. You just get as much as you possibly can get, because that's what makes sense. So again, if that assumption is wrong, we had better figure out soon where we got it wrong and begin to live our lives in a different way. So that's how all of this can make for a better world. There's another kind of answer to that, which is that when we do studies on things like psychic healing, or energy healing, spiritual healing, whatever you want to call it, we find that it actually does something. It means that there's alternative ways of dealing with very pragmatic problems, maybe ones of health, that from a mainstream perspective are only now just barely beginning to be accepted, usually under the umbrella of integrated medicine. But it is still very strongly rejected, or resisted at least, within medicine as something that we should even look into. So you look at the amount of money that the National Institutes of Health spends on things like cancer research and cardiovascular research. It's many, many $billions a year. How much money is being spent on something like energy healing or psychic healing? And the answer is zero, even though there is experimental evidence that it actually does something. So once again, it shows the power of an existing worldview to determine how we behave. Well, I think that's another good reason why this would make for a better world. We simply were more tolerant to these kinds of ideas. And by the way, these ideas are bound in culture. And so the culture in the Western world, which primarily means the United States, maybe a little bit of Canada, and big chunks of Europe, are pretty strongly dead set in the Western scientific worldview. This is not the case in South America. It's not the case in Asia or Southeast Asia. And they're much, much more open to these kinds of ideas. So some of it depends on where you are in the world. Actually, a lot of it depends on where you are in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Sharon says, I was recently asked to propose a lunch and learn talk at presume this means University of Colorado.
Mm-hmm.
Proposed discussing ideas such as intention and manifestation. I was denied because they told it wasn't empirical enough. Yeah, so remember I brought up a picture of Grumpy Cat? How does one overcome the resistance to these ideas? Yeah, so it's the Grumpy Cat problem. So we're dealing with a taboo. And the taboo prevents people who probably ought to know what the data is from even looking at the data. And if they do look at the data, and they're coming from a position where they're expecting that it's not very good, the data is impossible, so it can't be very good, they will evaluate the data as much, much poorer than looking at a study which is actually not very good methodologically, but happens to match the prevailing worldview. So there are many studies that have looked at this in social psychology. You get the same study, exactly the same study, and there's several ways of showing bias when it comes to reviews. So if you put in the same study an abstract, which is just like one or two words different, you have one word on maybe on a psychic topic, which shows a negative result in an experiment. You have exactly the same one that just has a positive result. So it's basically the same paper, but one is positive towards psychic phenomena, the other one is negative. And now you give it to people, and you will find that their assessment of the paper is completely determined by whether they previously thought that these phenomena were possible or not. So if you have lots of academics who are trained in materialism, who then look at these phenomena and they say, oh, this study got a positive result, they either won't publish it, if they're an editor, or they'll read it and say, well, obviously this article is flawed because they came up with an impossible result. This goes on all the time. So how do we overcome the resistance? It's not an easy question to answer. I wish I knew what the answer was. My personal way is to keep doing the research, publish it in as best journals as we can get, give a lot of talks about this. There are many, many academics, including people in prominent places, big Ivy League schools, where academics who are very interested in these things, including doing their own experiments in things like psychic phenomena, except that they're not publishing it because the social taboo in the academic world is such that they're going to get a huge amount of bounce back from their colleagues, so they don't talk about it, which is a pity. So the approach that I'm taking is to and we don't know if this is going to work or not, by the way, but it's what we're doing. We're creating, or we'd like to create, a university-based consortium for consciousness studies that is unlike most of the centers We're trying to create a university-based consortium at a major school, major university in the US, that is unlike a couple of centers for consciousness study that are located at other universities. Most centers for consciousness studies are actually about neuroscience and philosophy. That's it. So there's a lot that can be said in neuroscience and philosophy, but none of them address issues that go beyond it. So what we want to do is a truly multidisciplinary approach to consciousness, where all disciplines are invited in, including people looking at psychic phenomena and other kinds of anomalies associated with consciousness, and to do it in a serious way. So we're talking about somewhere between 6 and 9 universities, all with senior professors involved, that is administered in a particular university that has support of a couple of billionaires. So anyway, if we're successful in creating this university-based consortium, that will go a long way because it'll show that it is allowable. Like any taboo, it's all about what you can talk about in public. If we can show that there's senior professors and doing this thing, they're talking about it in public, it begins to break the taboo. And once a taboo is broken, it's very likely that you'll see like a dam burst, because many, many people have experiences of this type, including academics, and they just don't want to talk about it. In fact, we know from surveys that we've run that the majority of the population, including the vast majority of scientists and engineers, have had one or more personal experiences that could be regarded as psychic. So it's not that people don't have these experiences, it's completely about a taboo. So that's the, and we're taking ideas from other taboos that have been broken, things like same-sex marriage and legalized marijuana. They both provide ways of studying how you break taboos. In both of those cases, 20 years ago, it would be laughable that both would now be broken, but then they break. And the moment they break, it's suddenly like everybody looks backward on it and say, well, why were we so resistant to this? It's not a big deal. Something like that's going to happen here, but it's taking a lot of behind the scenes work to make that happen. So University of Colorado might be one of those centers, but we're not sure yet.
Yeah. May I make a comment on that? I think that I agree that there are many more people in those positions of science and medicine and psychology that have had experiences that they know or they sense were real, they can't deny, but they don't feel free to speak about it. And one of the things that really opened my eyes as to how many, just in the general population, how many people are interested in these topics was when they made the film, What the Bleep Do We Know? And they tried to get it released in theaters, and no theater would show it because they said, absolutely not, nobody's going to come to this. And then one theater in Seattle decided to take a chance, and they were sold out for months. And then all the theaters around the country, I remember in Boulder, it was held over for about 3 months. And all around the country, people were flocking to see this movie. And it really showed me, we're the quiet majority. Really are.
Yeah, by a long shot.
Mm-hmm.
So we did a survey among the general population and also scientists and engineers, subset of the population, where we gave a list of 25 different kinds of experiences that people have reported. We didn't use the word psychic in any of it. We just gave a description of an experience, all of which actually were psychic though, but without using those terms. And we asked people to list which ones of those they had personally experienced. Mm-hmm. So we among the general population that 94% of the population put down at least one of the 25, and on average 7 of the 25 that they had personally experienced. So it shows vast majority of the general population have these experiences, have any of them. And then among scientists and engineers, 93% had the same answer, and on average, 8 of the 25 experiences. So this confirmed what we thought was probably true, that the vast majority of people in the population, including academics, scientists, engineers, these things happen. People interpret them in different ways. Some interpret them in religious ways, some in completely secular ways, some as coincidence, synchronicities, and so on. But because it's so popular, this is one of the reasons why in the entertainment business that there are so many movies and plays and books and so on. It's a multi-billion dollar industry that take advantage of the fact that people have these experiences, and so they like stories to talk about them. So it's a very obvious kind of taboo then that goes on. You can talk about this in terms of what people believe and what stories people like to hear. In a scientific world, you're not supposed to talk about these things as real. Kind of nutty, but that's the way it is.
Sharon says, come to CU and sign me up.
Well, if CU ends up being one of the consortium, even if it doesn't, we figure that if we get 6 to 9 universities to sign up, that others will follow, right? So the idea about breaking a taboo is that you can push it, push like crazy to make it happen. That doesn't work so well. It works a lot better if you lead in a way that causes other people to follow. Most people feel more comfortable following. So who are they going to follow? They're going to follow the thought leaders. So that's the point of a university consortium. It involves the thought leaders. These are people who are secure enough in their position, so they don't really care too much about social taboos because their position is so high and conventional topics that they can get away with it. It's a little bit easier for academics in the UK to get away with this because they're allowed to be eccentric. In fact, it's almost expected that some academics will be eccentric. And so you could hold strange beliefs as an academic in the UK, and it's okay. That is not okay in the US. If you're too eccentric, you will not be an academic for very long. So again, it's a cultural thing.
Like Bucky Fuller said, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. You have to build a new model.
Build something that is better and people will follow.
Yeah, that makes the existing model obsolete.
Yep.
Do you find that more and more people are having these experiences, not just are coming out of the closet, but actually there are more and more people having these experiences?
I don't think so.
No?
I think we're simply hearing about it more. There's a beginning like cracks in the taboo, and so people, not academics so much, but general public is beginning to be more open about their experience.
In the medical field, the technological improvements in resuscitative techniques
Yes.
have ushered in a lot more near-death experiences reported.
Right. Also, in the medical world, the notion that spiritual beliefs are positively correlated with health outcomes. So that's pretty well established now. That's relatively new because up in like 30 years ago, nobody spent any attention at all about spiritual beliefs. It just wasn't an issue. Mm-hmm. Now, so there's slow breaking of taboos on many different fronts. There's a small but growing group of physicists who are now much more open about the idea that they think consciousness is fundamental in some way and is wrapped into physics in some way. So it's been not the mainstream by any means, but there are mainstream physicists who are beginning to talk in these terms. Mm-hmm. So you begin to see some changes of this sort. It's new from the point of view of 20 to 30 years ago, so there's progress. It's in my field in particular, in doing psychic research as a scientist, in the 1970s, it was a very hot topic. lots of laboratories, lots of people involved. There, at the same time, though, like at the edge, the tail edge of the psychedelic revolution, when all of the laws went into place and the world became, at least the United States, became much more conservative. For a period of almost 20 years, it became really, really quiet. Very few people, very little funding, very little progress. Now we're beginning to break that taboo as well. Much more interest, a huge amount of interest in psychedelics now. So that's at some point, some of the psychedelics will no longer be Schedule 1. Slowly, more laboratories, more academics are being open about their interest in psychic phenomena, more people in business as well. So this is like a generational process, which means 20 to 30 years in order to see these changes. Again, the US, strangely, is among the most conservative in this regard for two reasons. One is that the way science works in the US is driven very heavily by money. So the money determines what you're allowed to talk about. Mm. The second reason is that the US is a very religious country, particular fundamentalist religion. So people who are fundamentalists have two feelings about psychic phenomena and about magic. There's some that think it's the work of the devil, and they're not shy about telling you that, because that's what, at least what the Catholic Catechism says very clearly. This is the work of the devil, it's demonic, so you shan't do that. But there's another large batch of people who are very religious who see this as a confirmation of their core beliefs. Because, just to give one example, the Bible is a taxonomy of psychic phenomena. Like you need magic, you need psychic phenomena in order to make sense of what's going on in the Bible. So if you can show that some of these effects can be demonstrated in a scientific way, that is perceived as being very helpful. So you get it from both sides. Some people saying, no, it's demonic, it shall stop, and others saying, this is great because it's confirming my beliefs. Unfortunately, for some segment of scientists, they see it as supporting religious beliefs. And they don't like it at all, because they don't want religious beliefs to be real, because they look at religion and saying we don't need religion anymore. So you have lots of emotion wrapped up simply in what I perceive as people report interesting experiences. Wouldn't it be interesting if we studied them and found out more about what these things are? My position is rare. It shouldn't be rare, but it is. And so that's the state of affairs where we are now. But as I said, I'm optimistic because I'm chronically optimistic to begin with. But secondly, because when you look at the long term over the past 60 to 80 years, we're clearly on an upswing in terms of increased tolerance and funding as well.
Yeah, in Brazil, the spiritists in Brazil do a lot of research in the medical field about non-physical dimensions of healing, and they have conferences. And in this country, there's a Spiritist Medical Congress that happens every 2 years, and they have they invite American doctors and psychologists, psychiatrists who are doing research on these elements, these dimensions, and of course Brazilians and occasionally someone from England or other parts of South America will present the research that they're doing. And it's really funny because most of the American presenters are doing research still on trying to prove that it's real. And right. The other researchers from Brazil and other parts of the world are applying the reality is a given, and they're applying it to, like we're researching the pineal gland to see what role does it play in clairvoyance and things like that.
Right.
So it's really funny, the contrast in the type of research that's being done.
Yeah, it's cultural, and I see it very clearly because I'm an editor of a medical journal. Mm. And we get articles from Brazil, they will use terms like, for example, one I just saw the other day about Joe Ray, which is a healing technique like Reiki. And so in the description of Joe Ray, they describe it as a way of intentionally using universal energy or spiritual energy. And that's simply taken as a given, as you said. Yeah. So they're doing it in a certain way. And so as the journal editor, especially one that comes out of the United States, I have to write back saying, well, you probably should say something like, it is said that it is based on universal energy, or purported or hypothetical universal energy, because we don't actually know what that is, right? From a scientific perspective, we can use those terms, but we don't exactly know what it is. It's a hypothesis. So yeah, I see that all the time. Even with papers coming out of China, for example, it'll assume that the qi is a real thing. Even from a scientific perspective, we don't know what it is. You can see effects sometimes, but we don't know what that is. Or terms like vital energy and so on. These have not penetrated the Western scientific mindset. So you're doing a medical journal, you have to make sure that you're writing something that people are going to understand and resonate with.
I think we have another question.
Have you had any psychic at all experiences in your life? Yes, I have. I did not get into this line of research because of them. In fact, when I was growing up, probably at least till about age 20, I can't recall any psychic experiences at all. And nor did anyone in my family ever report such experiences. So this is not the example where somebody grows up in a family where this is happening all the time. For me, the reason why I got interested in this is purely out of curiosity. Also probably some rebelliousness, where as soon as a lot of people start angrily saying that something is impossible, I get kind of suspicious about that. Like what does it matter? Why does it matter so much to you that this is impossible? And so I was interested in, first of all, why is there emotion attached to it? And second, why would it matter if these things are real? I think it'd be kind of interesting if it was. But probably the most important was that you could apply the tools and techniques of science to find out if they're real. So I started doing that even as a teenager. And I discovered pretty early on that I was good at these experiments. I could get results. So in many ways, most of the psychic experiences that I regard as being the most meaningful to me were the experiments that I ran, because these are done under conditions where you have as much control as you can get, and the results are quite good in statistical terms. They're not like mind-boggling, but good. You have high confidence in the result. And that's pretty much what convinced me. It took a good 5 to 10 years of doing experiments before I was able to overcome 20 years of training in Western materialism to get to the point where I said, oh, maybe I don't quite understand the world as much as I thought I did. So that's the kind of experiences that I put more confidence in, even though I've had other experiences of telepathy and precognition and a variety of other things happen. Mostly after I began to study these things in my late 20s. That's when these effects were started to happen, or at least I think more likely that in retrospect is when I began to notice them, rather than they started at that point. So I know generally when people ask that question, they want to hear a bunch of stories. My stories are no better or worse than anybody else's stories in this domain. So I don't put a lot of emphasis on them. And the other reason, though, is that I've worked with people who are very, very talented psychics and mediums and channelers, people like that. And that tells me that I don't have a particular talent in this domain. I'm good at experiments, so maybe that's my talent, but in terms of really good clairvoyance, for example, or really good precognition, I know people who can do these things, and it's so much better than I can do that I look at the stories that I can tell and say, this is like nothing. It's not even that interesting. So that's why I don't talk about those experiences that much.
Has the experiments that have been done on the consciousness of the heart have indicated that, the one that I think HeartMath did, and it's been replicated all over, where there are random images. Ooh, can't hear you. Did you say something? Uh-oh. You're mute again. Let me.
Internet connection is unstable.
Now I hear you.
Okay, so it came back.
Yeah.
So the studies at HeartMath, and this is similar, Tink is asking a similar question. Studies at HeartMath were actually a replication of studies that I began in the mid-1990s. I helped HeartMath with the design of their studies and gave them the actual target photos that I had used. So they're a little more aggressive in talking about them. I mean, I published the articles and I don't particularly talk about it all the time. But their stuff was a replication of mine.
I see. My question was, it was established that the heart would react prior to seeing a disturbing picture, a disturbing image on the screen, right? Several seconds before the disturbing image would come up, the heart would react. Was anything ever concluded from that? Why or how? Or
well, I that's one interpretation. I don't think it's correct. Their interpretation was the heart responds before the skin conductance or before the brain.
yes.
That's what the data shows, but I think it's a misinterpretation of what's actually going on. And the reason is that these results that we call presentiment, meaning pre-feel, they are physiological responses which are reverse time symmetries of physiological responses after a stimulus. So if you measure changes in heart rate after you see an emotional picture, it can take about 8 seconds to see the beginning of the effect and about 8 seconds before it's over. So if you look, the presentiment effect occurs about 8 seconds before the image shows up. That's what I mean, time symmetry. If you do this in skin conductance, the effect starts and is over within around 3 seconds. That's what you see in the presentiment. It's around 3 seconds before the stimulus. In the brain, it's about 1 second. In the gut, it's almost 30 seconds. And pupil dilation, it's about a half a second. So you generally see as a presentiment a time symmetric effect depending on the speed of response of a physiological system. And so that's why it can look as though the heart is responding much before something else, but that's only because it's a much slower response. So it goes slower backwards in time. That's, I think, what's happening. With these presentiment effects in skin conductance, pupil dilation, heart rate, blood pressure, and EEG, brain activity. And these very similar effects in all of these studies. It doesn't always work. Sometimes we'll do a study that we think is exactly the same as the other ones, and it doesn't work very well. This is true with actually all of the experiments that we do. Sometimes we are running what looks like the same experiment and it just doesn't work. So it's one of the many mysteries here that we're dealing with fairly subtle skills that can be interfered with by many, many different factors. And so it's one of the challenges then. It's one of the things that makes it interesting too, that if we understood it completely, we could turn this into a technology quickly. We're influenced by many, many different factors. And so part of the research then is to figure out, well, what matters? What correlates? And we know, for example, that one of the things that correlates with psychic performance in the lab, also in life, is the state of the geomagnetic field. So for most people, that's invisible. We can't sense the geomagnetic field. It's pretty weak, but it's a real thing that's measurable. And we find there's a correlation between the state of the Earth's magnetic field and whether or not somebody's going to be able to perform well in a psychic task, and also what happens spontaneously in everyday life in psychic terms. So on a stormy geomagnetic day, you don't get good performance. On a quiet day, you do. So that's just one of many factors, most of which are invisible. I mean, they're measurable, but people don't pay much attention to it. That modulates these abilities. Another one, for example, is lunar cycle. This is probably why, from a pagan perspective or an esoteric ceremonial perspective, the state of the moon was a very important factor.
I have a quote from Nikola Tesla, who said, "The day science begins to study non-physical phenomena, it will make more progress in one decade than in all the previous centuries of its existence."
Yep.
Yeah, I like that.
Yep, he was probably right.
And he was a pretty smart guy.
Yeah. It's not generally known that most of the founders, I think with only one exception, most of the founders of quantum mechanics held the philosophy of idealism. Mm-hmm. They weren't materialists. It's one of the reasons why they spent so much time and energy talking about what does quantum mechanics mean? Like, what kind of reality is it describing? It's also one of the reasons why most of them have said and written that they felt that consciousness was fundamental. A good example is Max Planck, who came up with the idea of the quantum, has written many, many things about the idea of consciousness as fundamental. So what's interesting about this is that these are all very prominent physicists who came up with the best physical theory that we know, and yet they did not think that physics was fundamental. So it does not stop somebody from being a very rigorous scientist if you hold a different set of fundamental beliefs about the nature of reality. Many scientists today don't know that these scientists were idealists, or they may think that you can't be an idealist because then you're not a proper scientist in some way. Many prominent scientists had a very different kind of set of beliefs from a fundamental perspective. The other thing that we see again and again now is that for somebody going through a scientific career, the likelihood that they will have taken a course on the philosophy of science is very, very low. So they don't see even why you would need to study philosophy at all. Even prominent scientists are saying that science does not need philosophy, which only shows that they don't understand that there are assumptions underlying what scientists do. Those assumptions need to be looked at carefully because some of them almost certainly are not correct. Referred to the Air Force as equipment that has detected a unified field. Is this accurate? I don't know because I don't know what that refers to. And Brenda says, can you point to resources about the power of prayer or even the collective definitions of prayer as a form of communicating in the realms of real magic? So the power of prayer, well, from a scientific perspective, most of the studies of the power of prayer were about healing, intercessory prayer. There were quite a few studies looking at intercessory prayer. Some colleagues and I did a meta-analysis of all of the known studies. We published this about 5 years ago or so to see whether these studies showed any evidence. And there's no conclusion that can be reached. In other words, we can't say definitely yes, and we can't say definitely no. The evidence is insufficient to say that the studies of intercessory prayer work. And we speculate that the reason why they don't work very well is because it's uncontrolled. That's why I prefer laboratory studies. So by uncontrolled, what we mean is that if somebody is ill, or you take a population of people in a hospital that have cardiovascular problems or so on, and you assign a group to pray for them, that you can control what the group does, but you can't control what everybody else does. So most people in the hospital will at least have others who are thinking about them and wishing them well. Well, that's a big uncontrolled factor then. It diminishes the difference between a control group and a prayer group to such an extent that it introduces all kinds of noise into the experiment, and that's why we think, at least one of the reasons why these experiments don't work very well. If you go into the laboratory and you study not prayer for healing, but intention, prayer is a kind of intention to, does it influence physiology? Not a healing outcome, but simply physiology. The answer there is much clearer. The answer is yes. So intention on somebody at a distance will affect their physiology. That lends some credence to the idea that maybe prayer would influence health, but doing studies, clinical studies on health outcomes is really, really difficult and expensive, and it doesn't work so well for prayer. As far as collective definitions of prayer as a form of communicating in the realms of real magic, I'm not exactly sure what that means. Prayer I interpret as forms of intention, and I was then demonstrating in my talk that does intention change how people perceive food and how people perceive beverage like tea, and does it make seeds grow, and does it influence random numbers and so on? There the answer is pretty clear, that the answer is yes. What happens if there are collectives? You have 20 people or 100 people doing these intentional acts. One thing we know is that it does not increase linearly. So if you have one person do an experiment and I have 10 people do the same experiment, you don't get 10 times better results. You oftentimes will get much less results. And the reason we think is because the effect that like one person can be very coherent within themselves in terms of they have a pure intention for something to happen. The moment you have two people, that they might have slightly different intentions, and that's going to interfere with each other. If you have 10 people, you have 10 different kinds of interference, and it tends to wash itself out. So it's only in unusual circumstances where you have groups that are extremely coherent, and they're all, in a sense, on the same wavelength, where you're able to show that the intentional effect is there at all. And if you're lucky, sometimes you show actually a larger effect. But those are somewhat unusual because it's very difficult to get a group of people who are intentionally doing the same thing at the same time and coherent. Mm-hmm. The alternative is to do studies where you have collectives who are paying attention to the same thing at the same time. And under those conditions, you can show that there are changes in the physical world that you can measure. They're relatively small in magnitude, but the attention alone is detectable as an effect. So maybe because people are not trying to intentionally do something, they're simply attending to something that is happening. Yeah, so blessed chocolate is a form of prayer or ceremony. Yeah, in that case, it was the Buddhist monks or the Mongolian shaman were doing a blessing. So yeah, you could see that as a form of prayer, as an intentional act. Yep.
In Spiritist healing, we bless water. We run energy into a little cup of water, little glass of water, and give it to the person to drink after the session. Mm-hmm. They have done studies in Brazil that showed a difference in the molecular structure and composition of the water before and after.
Yeah, we're doing a large-scale study now with various kinds of healers, psychic healers, spiritual healers, shamanistic healers, all kinds. 17 healers. The plan was 240 clients. I don't think we got that many, about 200 clients. Each client was suffering from carpal tunnel pain, wrist pain or hand pain. And so we also used water in that study as a proxy for the human body, because human adults are 60 to 70% water. And in terms of the hydrogen-oxygen bond, we're probably over 90% water, at least HO bonds. So water is a very good proxy for the body. The healers both healed a vial of water on a tabletop, as though it was a client. And also the healer wore a small vial of water around their neck while they were healing, and the client did too, another little vial of water. And afterwards, we put the water through a spectrometer, which allowed us to measure the molecular vibratory rate of the water. Because the idea was that if the water was affected, that you could see a structural change in the bonding caused by the healing, then we'd be able to measure that. So I'm just now at the point where we've just today finished the study. So I have this big pile of data, and I've been analyzing it along the way. And I do see changes. There's structural changes in the hydrogen-oxygen bonds, both for the water that was healed directly on a tabletop, and for the somewhat smaller effect for the water that they were wearing around their necks as they were doing the healing. Most of that was seen around the water that the healers were wearing, not so much in the clients. So yeah, we did see. Of course, the reason why we're doing this is we're looking not only for subjective relief of pain, which we also saw, we're looking for objective ways of measuring healing effects. So we're seeing that water is one way that we're looking at it. Makes it an easy substance to measure.
Yeah, and assuming that the water has the properties that the individual needs for healing, ingesting the water, we still don't know how that.
Well, yeah, if we consist of 90% hydrogen-oxygen bonds, and we can change the structure of those bonds, that suggests that, yeah, there's some kind of real healing that's going on. Mm-hmm. So Tink asks, any thoughts on the law of attraction? Mm-hmm. So I talk about this in my book, Real Magic. The law of attraction, you can trace all the way back through all of the esoteric traditions. You see it again and again in many different forms. It's essentially the idea in ceremonial magic. Practically every grimoire, book of spells, is basically about the law of attraction. It's based on an idea which is not scientific, but nevertheless part of the esoteric worldview, saying that things are correlated with each other. So if you hold certain thoughts, you will begin to draw those thoughts to you. So in the laboratory, we don't talk about it in those terms, but in any time we do an experiment where we're using intention to try to influence something, in many ways that is kind of a law of attraction. We're putting out a statement of something that we wish to happen, and then we measure a system, a physical system typically, sometimes also the human body, to see if that statement happens. And more often than not, it does, at least statistically speaking. So the problem with law of attraction as presented in books like The Secret is that it implies that you can do almost anything that you want. It implies very big effects. Sometimes big effects do occur, but most of the time it does not. And so we're in a difficult position here then in saying that from a scientific perspective, I would say, yeah, the law of attraction looks like there's actually evidence, good scientific evidence supporting the idea, except that it's a much weaker effect than we would like it to be. And in many ways, it's actually fortunate, because one of the things I talk about in my book, Real Magic, is what would be the consequences if the law of attraction was actually as powerful as it is portrayed to be in some books. And the answer is it would be a disaster. There are all those instances where you had a flash of anger because somebody did something, or you waited online at the bank and they close it just as you approach it after waiting for 2 hours, and on and on and on. That if your flash of anger turns into action, we will wipe each other out very quickly because we don't have much practice in terms of keeping a very stable internal calm space. We're not built that way. Our emotions generally are pretty, we can block it. We have impulse control, but not mentally. Like, you have the flash of anger, it's there. If that gets turned into action too quickly, we would be in a very bad position. So it's good that the law of attraction works. It can be useful for things. But on the other hand, think about the other 7 billion people who are thinking, oh, no, you don't. Another reason why it's pretty small. If I'm thinking I want a gold-plated Mercedes to show up on my driveway tomorrow, where I own the title somehow, that has to come from somewhere. Somebody no longer has a gold-plated Mercedes, unless it dropped out of the sky, which is unlikely. So everything you do has a consequence, every attraction that you're creating. The other thing is, from a magical tradition, if you use the law of attraction to override somebody else's free will, and this happens all the time with things like love spells, that is considered black magic. The moment that you override somebody else's choice or free will, that is a big no-no. That's what creates Darth Vader, basically. So when you look at just do a taxonomy of the kinds of spells that you see in grimoires, the vast majority of them are black magic. They might not be portrayed in those forms. They might be considered gray magic. But even in the case of praying for somebody without their knowledge and consent, that would be considered black magic because you're overriding their will. If you get their consent, it's fine. But you shall not. In fact, this you even see in the Catholic Catechism. You shall not pray for somebody else's health without their permission. In fact, it goes even further in the Catechism. It says you shan't do this under any condition. Even if you do have their permission, don't do it. But from a magical perspective, you can, but only if you get permission. So you can see the slippery slope that happens pretty quickly. The moment you start seeing that the magical spells are real, that they actually do things, yeah, it gets tricky. You have to think about the ethics of what you're doing. So there's an interesting wrinkle to all this, and that's about binding spells. So a binding spell is not considered black magic, even though it sort of is. The binding spell, for example, when after Donald Trump was elected president, a whole bunch of witches put binding spells on Donald Trump, which is a spell to prevent actions coming out of the administration from causing other people harm. So it's black magic in the sense that it's overriding people's actions, but it's in the sense that it is for good. It's for the common good. So the demonstration of the slippery slope. It is black magic, but for beneficial results, binding magic. Mm. So if I was interested in strengthening and building stronger and more reliable psiability, what would you recommend? The same answer always, meditation. Yes. To focus the mind and to reject the monkey mind, the chattering that goes on all the time. So that is the time-honored, most gentle, and probably most effective way of improving psi abilities. And we did a survey, actually, beginning and advanced meditators, asking when you started to meditate, did you notice any difference in terms of your experience? And gave a couple of examples. And we saw essentially that 75% of the meditators said, yeah, they'd noticed more synchronicities, occasional telepathic experiences. All of these were spontaneous effects, but that the effects occurred all within the psychic domain is evidence that when Patanjali was talking about the effects of meditation and classical yoga, he wrote the entire book, like the third book of the Yoga Sutras is all about various psychic abilities that arise as the result of advanced meditative practice. So that's the easy way. But Patanjali also says that certain drugs will do it, being born in a fortuitous way. You can't really control that very much. Well, the drugs we know, for example, just anecdotally at this point, that psilocybin under the right conditions, ayahuasca under certain conditions will, at least momentarily, blast you into spaces that are probably psychic. We don't know for sure, though, because in those states you also get a lot of distortions. So it's hard to know whether people are actually being more psychic. Seems so, but we don't know. I talk more about synchronicities.
I was just going to say that intuition has a lot to do with noticing synchronicities, and honoring your intuition or heeding your intuition goes a long way towards increasing the ability to hear the intuition. And so that too, but I agree, meditation is the number one.
Right. Synchronicities, of course, are meaningful coincidences. In a sense, what we do in the laboratory is try to evoke a meaningful coincidence. That's what all of our experiments are about. We assign somebody to make a synchronicity happen right now under conditions that we predefine, and we can do it. It's not as strong typically as a synchronicity in everyday life. It doesn't have the same level of meaning to it, because it does to the experimenters, but generally not to the participants. Because of some synchronicities that I've had, which were quite unexpected, as most really good synchronicities are, I think of it as kind of a metaphor, that the strong intention will draw effects towards you, very much like the law of attraction. The attraction is kind of like a gravitational pull. And so if you have one or more people strongly intending for something, it's as though it is pulling events towards you. It's increasing the probabilities that certain things will happen. So you can have very unlikely events occurring at the same time at the same place, which would be experienced as a synchronicity, in very much the same way as the gravity pulls things together. That seems to be, I think of it as a metaphor. It might be actually stronger than a metaphor. It might be an analogy or even literal. But that's kind of what it feels like to me. When you have something very unexpected occur that is also very meaningful.
Mm-hmm. I think it's also, you can train yourself to see things symbolically, symbolic sight, which one of the things I teach is dream work. And when you do dreams, you're looking at everything symbolically. And I think that our waking lives are full of symbols all the time also. So when you say it's like a metaphor, it is, I think, that helps too.
Mm-hmm.
To develop symbolic sight, whether you're talking about a dream or your waking life.
Right. And as I said in my talk, that the leading edge in science today is beginning to see reality as symbolic.
Yes.
And this, of course, is also the essence of magical practices, that the reason why voodoo works, the reason why any ceremonial magic works, it's all about the manipulation of symbols, where the symbols are deeply linked to the nature of reality itself. So from a scientific perspective, I mean, I normally am wearing my scientist hat. What I just said as a scientist is crazy. But then when I put a magic hat, saying, oh, okay, that's kind of the way it works. So that's why I think it's interesting that at the leading edge of science today, you're getting people beginning to talk in these terms, not as an esotericist. They're not using those terms. They might not even think of it as magic, esoteric magic, but that's essentially what it is. At least that's my interpretation of what it is.
Yeah. I think magic has, it's kind of a loaded word. And probably a lot of people, if they hear the word magic, they think of something negative, which is,
Yeah, I don't know why that is. I mean,
yeah.
it's definitely a loaded term, and I specifically chose it on my book because I knew it would pique interest.
Mhm.
Um, but I don't know why it has such a strong negative connotation, other than in a religious sense.
We're a puritanical country.
Well, yeah, and it doesn't help by having every other magical themed movie being a horror film.
Exactly.
So I'm working with a screenwriter on a story where we're talking about magic as part of the plot, with a completely different spin to it. I mean, I'm putting a scientific spin on it. I'm going to say, look, this is simply a factor of nature. It's like a force of nature. It's no different than learning about atomic energy. It could be used for good. It could also be used for bad.
Mhm.
But as a force of nature, it is what it is. It's a thing.
Mhm.
And importantly, it's a force of nature that is related in some way to our own consciousness. And that makes it really, really interesting and probably really useful and probably really dangerous. So, what else is new? Every time we learn anything, it has the capacity for helping us or hurting us. And it's up to us to make the right decisions so we use it in a beneficial way.
Yeah. It's the same with movies about mediumship or clairvoyance. They're always horror films. They always have a scary component.
Yeah, so some
Like,
of that is based on audience expectations. But a lot of it, though, is also that when I talk to novelists and screenwriters who are preparing new series or new books and so on, their understanding of the nature of these phenomena is at a very elementary level, that they've read novels, fiction, not nonfiction. And so it's not surprising then that if they're writing within a certain genre, like horror, um, that's all they know. And so the challenge then, the interesting challenge from my perspective is, how do you write a story that is using psychic phenomena and some magical practices, and spin it so that it has some degree of tension in it. Every story needs tension, so
mhm.
that you don't need to go to horror. You need to go to tension. You have to figure out what that means, and then use it in a positive way. So there are stories like that, very limited though, in terms of the number of movies, especially movies. There's somewhat more novels, perhaps. Um, so we're writing what we hope turns into a series, maybe on Netflix or somewhere else,
Great.
that would present this in a very different way, positive way.
So I want to thank you, Dean, for this really compelling presentation and very engaging, informative question and answer. You were right. It can go on forever.
So let's take Sharon's question as the last one, and then we'll
Ah,
wrap
okay.
it. So Sharon asks, you mentioned that geomagnetic storms affect psychic tasks. Is there an effect on healing like Reiki too? I don't know anybody who's done a study on Reiki or any energy healing method looking at correlations with the geomagnetic field. However, as I said, we just finished this long series of studies with about 200 clients, which was done over a period of about 7 or 8 months. So we will be looking at correlations with lots of environmental effects, geomagnetic fields, other geocosmic fields, solar cycle, lunar cycle, solar wind, things like that, in correlation with the measures that we're taking and with the subjective reports from the healers and with clients. So we'll find out. Maybe healing doesn't work very well when there's a geomagnetic storm, or maybe position of the sun makes a difference, or the season may make a difference, or the temperature. We'll be looking at all of that to find out, because as I said, most previous studies that I'm aware of looking at these kinds of healing tasks have not looked at these other environmental factors. So we're breaking new ground, we think.
Again, thank you so much,
You're
Dean,
welcome.
for being with us for these 2 hours. And I look forward to seeing your research as it continues, seeing the movie that you come up with on these phenomena, and also welcome you to present any of your research at any time for Caritas.
Okay. Thank you
very much.